Welcome to a special year-end episode of Character Evolution Cast. We had a very wonderful conversation with some of the folks at the RPG Lessons Learned podcast that we're really excited to present to you. But first, as usual, some announcements.
It has been almost exactly a year since the idea for this podcast was first conceived, and we are absolutely stunned that Ryan's middle of the night thought grew into something this amazing. I think it was January 3rd.
Podcast concept that I think I would love to do. Character Create Cast. A podcast where a group creates characters from different games, discusses the process, and compares it to similar games. Would be a great learning tool for players new to certain games, I'd think. That sounds just like our podcast.
What a good idea. And then somebody responded to that tweet, I think.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. What did they...
Here's Amelia's response back on January 3rd. Oh my god, this sounds amazing. Cargen is one of my favorite parts of gaming. 3 exclamation points.
Holy crap, I was excited.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I just looked. The first time that you and I sat down and had a face-to-face via webcam conversation was January 11th. So,
wow.
Yeah, we are almost exactly a year out, and it is absolutely mind-blowing to me like how far we've come and like what this podcast has become. We originally thought it would be a monthly thing. Then we added Character Evolution Cast, which is really almost an entirely different podcast. We are on the One Shot Network. We like holy crap, Ryan. This is for a middle of the night, quote unquote, shower thought. This is amazing. And I really want to say thank you to everybody listening to this, because we wouldn't still be here, I think, if it weren't for the support that we've gotten from people. And honestly, from the very beginning, when we first floated the idea, people have been so supportive, and it's honestly just astonishing. And I'm so glad that we decided to take the plunge. I'm so glad that we get to be a part of people's week every week. I'm so excited for what next year will bring. Like, this has just been, honestly, life-changing for me. It's been a crazy year. But the fact that it started right at the beginning of the year and it matches up with this end of the year sort of reflective period feels really cool.
Yeah.
And I don't care that this is going really long. I have so many feelings about this. And I'm so thankful for everybody listening and the people that have supported us, and for you and your good idea and your willingness to go along with my planning agendas and color-coded outlines. And oh gosh, this has been so good. What an adventure.
Yeah. It really has been such a blast. And I am just blown away every single time we get to do more cool things with more cool people out there, and having all of you people out there listening to this and commenting about the stuff that we're doing and showing how much you care about it. We really love having you here with us, and it really has just been so amazing and wonderful.
Yeah, it's gotten me through the last year for sure. Having something to kind of pour myself into and to get all of that positive, amazing feedback from people has really kept me going through a lot of really tough stuff this last year. So
yeah, exactly. I'm
so glad that we are doing this, and I can't wait to keep doing it for
2019.
Yes, for a million more years.
Exactly. A million. Well, speaking of amazing milestones this last year, my game, Chimera, is going to be at the Midwinter Gaming Convention in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in less than 2 weeks from the release of this episode. So I still have some spots available for games. I may have convinced Amelia to come along.
Possibly. If I can get a babysitter, I will be there.
Yeah. So if you're in the Milwaukee area and she can't find a babysitter, I don't know if she wants you watching her kids, but...
Yeah, call me. We can work something out. hey, rando internet person, can you just come stay with my kids so I can go play a game? I'm sure it'll be fine.
It'll be fine.
Child services, this was a joke.
Yep. Well, I would love to see some of all of you there. If you can make it, it should be a really fun time.
Absolutely. I'm hoping I can come because I really want to play in your game.
Yes.
Now with all of that out of the way, guess what? It's review time.
Review time.
We should write a song for that too. Review time.
We really should.
Yeah. Showbirds. This review comes from Two Head Turtle from the United States, and it is titled Really Does Build Character. A most excellent podcast. It provides fantastic insight into interesting game systems and provides perspective that is invaluable to anyone at all interested in playing, GMing, or game design. Every episode is entertaining, educational, and inspirational, all while you are being continually serenaded by Amelia and Ryan's dulcet tones. It will be a sad day when I finish their backlog and actually have to wait for new episodes. Oh,
thank you so
dulcet
much.
Tones. That's so nice.
We do have dulcet tones, do we not?
Sometimes. I use it's my NPR voice.
Yes, we get to our NPR voices and everybody falls asleep.
Thank you for listening to our cold open. Please enjoy the episode.
Yes, enjoy.
Welcome to Character Evolution Cast, a show where we discuss what to do with all those characters we just made. I'm one of your hosts, Amelia, and today my co-host Ryan and I are joined by Dusty and Mike of RPG Lessons Learned to talk about how to learn from your mistakes, missteps, and failures at the table.
Folks, welcome to Character Evolution Cast. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Appreciate it.
I just want to say, I've listened to a lot of your episodes, especially those systems that I'm interested in playing. I really enjoyed the Edge of the Empire episodes, and I really enjoyed the Masks episode as someone who has fantasized about playing a superhero game, but has never gotten around to actually running one.
Yes. I grew up on superhero games, so the Masks was particularly delicious to me.
Yeah, and we just did Heroes Unlimited, and that was less delicious.
Ooh. I missed that one. I'm going to go back and listen to that.
Well, no, it doesn't come. It'll come out next month, so.
That's why.
Right.
Okay. Mm-hmm. I thought if a superhero game had popped through the feed, I would have listened. Mm-hmm. It's funny. Mike and I had lunch today, and we had a huge realization about our game, especially in the context of your podcast. Mike, how often have we created characters? How often do we create characters?
In the approximately 10 years that we've been playing, maybe 3 times from scratch.
What?
I know, it's crazy.
That's crazy.
It's crazy.
Character creation has not been a huge part of our game. It's only a part of our game when there are tool sets that totally support it. Like D&D 4th edition had that amazing character builder. There are several apps for 5e that support character creation. And then Mike pointed out that we did manually create some characters in World of Dungeons.
But those were super duper easy, right? It's like 4 dice roll. You add up your numbers. You decide which trait you put them to. Bam, you got a character. No thought, no muss,
Wow.
no muss, no fuss.
So I'm intrigued then. What do you do otherwise? Do you find like pre-gens or?
Frequently, yeah. Aside from the very long 4th edition campaign, and then we converted those characters to 5th edition. So 4e and 5e, we did a lot of character creation with app support and software support. After that, we went through a really long period, including our long Pathfinder campaign, of one-shots using pre-generated characters. We did a ton of one-shots of quick starts using pre-gens, and then we did the whole Pathfinder beginner box campaign with those beginner box. What does Pathfinder call those characters? The archetypal characters.
That's fascinating to me.
Yeah.
I love how people play games so differently from each other. Like it's amazing to me how we are all like doing this hobby and everybody's experience is so wildly different, and the things that people love about it are so like insanely different from each other. It's so cool.
And I love the niches. Like I love the niche show. I love your show for having found this one specific niche that no other show does. When we did our show, it was like, there's so many RPG shows. How can we do one that's different? Oh, let's, be self-critical and let's grow right there live on the air. Let's recap our games, not for the point of recapping our games, not to share an AP, but just to share our learning process. So I like the idea of not another AP, not another, write in for advice show, but some different animal. So hats off to you for finding this niche that I didn't even know existed until you filled it.
Yeah, we were kind of surprised that nobody else had done it yet either, honestly.
It's good stuff, and it's missing from our game. So we talked about it at lunch, and we will think about adding character creation to our next campaign as a really important step.
Ooh.
Well, and then you'll have to do an episode and let us know how it goes.
Oh,
Absolutely.
we will.
Tell us what you learned from it.
Actually, not in the notes. I'm gonna jump in and say that for Christmas, I gave everyone the player's handbook to Castles and Crusades for us to actually, for the first time, create characters without software support that are fairly complex characters. So Mike will have to pay attention to how that goes.
Now, if I remember correctly, at the little get-together we had the other day, didn't you give Catherine's son a copy of that same Castles and Crusades? And didn't he create a character within like 10 minutes on his own?
Swords and Wizardry White Box.
Oh, my bad.
Which is D&D. It's D20 extremely light. And yes, he created a character very quickly because it is so lightweight.
Okay, I was thinking of a different system.
Well, there you go. Character creation. It's fun.
You can do it.
Well, let's get into some formal introductions, shall we? Dusty, can you go ahead and tell us a little bit more about yourself and some of the cool stuff you're involved in?
Absolutely. So my only public online presence is as one of the hosts of RPG Lessons Learned. You can find us online at rpglessonslearned.com. We are on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at RPGLL Podcast. All other social media is, private life, sharing kids with family. As far as trying to be out there and put something out, it's RPGLL. It's what I really care about. It's not something we're doing to try to be successful or widely known. We're just trying to put a little bit of positivity out there in the world of RPGs as a hobby. We're three guys that have careers and families, and we focus on that first. And this is a hobby that we like to share. I will share about Brian, since he can't be here with us tonight.
Yeah.
Brian's a really important host of RPGLL. Brian's an experienced podcaster, as opposed to Mike and I, who've only been doing it for the last year and a half. Brian's one of the hosts of Radio Free Cybertron, a Transformers podcast that is literally, arguably, one of the oldest podcasts on the internet. He was syndicating MP3s and RSS in 1999. So,
oh my gosh.
Yes.
Wow.
RFC has been around for a long time. So check out Brian at tfradio.net. And if you have a burning desire to listen to an entire podcast about Transformers, it exists, and it's actually really good.
I know people that will listen to that. That's or probably already do, potentially.
There you go.
And Mike, what about you? What do you have going on?
The only thing I really have going on outside of RPG Lessons Learned is I have a very unpopular, a very unwatched Twitch stream. I'm Mike G's Plays Games on Twitch, and I also have a small Twitter that I run in accordance with that Twitch at Mike G Plays Games. Other than that, I also interact with the RPG LL Twitter through that. So that's about it.
Well, that's plenty, though. If you're having fun,
Absolutely.
That's all that matters. And then you have to leave all the time for playing RPGs
That's right.
too, obviously.
That's right.
So you can't have a Twitch stream that takes up too much of your time.
Hopefully I'll be adding some actual play live streams to that channel as well soon too.
Ooh.
But
that would be fun.
That's to be determined.
Very cool. One of our goals on Character Creation Cast, aside from making amazing people, is to introduce our audience to people who are doing awesome things in the RPG world, and the real world too. So we are going to start there. Now, you make a show about confronting and acknowledging your failures in games, but can you tell us about one of your greatest gaming successes?
Absolutely. And I'm actually really glad you asked this question because we get this a lot. And I know it does seem like our show really focuses on failure because failure drives the most conversation in the show. But we do talk a lot about successes too. Great games, great moments that we've had. And we really do want the central message of our show to be positive. We want to empower people to approach the hobby as newcomers by sharing our failures so they can be learned from, sharing our successes so they can be, emulated when appropriate, when the situation calls for it. But most importantly, we really want to model constructive feedback for the audience. We'll probably never be a wildly popular show because we're not reality TV. We don't get mad. We don't fight. We don't call each other names. We listen. And a huge thing that we do on the show that you may notice if you listen to it is that when someone gives, me feedback as the forever DM, or I give one of the players feedback, there's this moment where I, as the DM, if I'm receiving the feedback, I always try to restate it in my own words. And that's where a lot of the video game analogies on our show come in, is let me make sure I understand what you're saying, Mike or Brian. You're saying this, and I relate it to something else. And if I can state their point, the feedback becomes more real for me. So I just wanted to throw that note in there and say that we do try to talk about a lot of our positives. But to go ahead and actually answer your question, for me as a player, one of the most positive moments of my gaming career was joining my friend Martin's game. Martin runs this game. Everyone says there are three types of games that focus on the plot, games that focus on the characters, and games that focus on the setting or the world. And Martin runs the latter. The setting is the point of his game. He has a degree in sociology. He has a master's degree in criminology. He creates this incredibly engaging world with intricate societies. And I'm so privileged to play in his game. And I approached his game for the first time in my gaming career with a backstory and a plot. And I kept it small at first, and then he and I grew it together. And that backstory has not quite taken over his game because I encouraged the other player to do the same thing because I saw my backstory taking over. But watching that take on a life of its own and collaborating on the GM and growing that together, huge success moment for me about 10 sessions into that campaign when I realized that it happened and it blew my mind.
Nice.
That's awesome. Like seeing what you're doing have an effect on like the world and like where the story is going, and realizing I really like those moments where you get to see exactly how collaborative the experience is, and like the stuff that you brought to the table mattered, that you're not just like on this train headed somewhere and you have like no insight into it. Like those moments feel really good.
Absolutely. That's gaming gone right.
Yes, absolutely.
How about yourself, Mike?
I'd say I actually have two things that come right out to my mind, and they're actually kind of both related to each other. So the first one would be way back a long time ago when we were playing Dusk, game written by Mike Kroholik of the Penny Arcade. I think I said his name wrong. But we were playing this game, and it was one of probably my first times of really, I would say, associating myself with a character and getting into a role of a character where I took it upon myself to lead this investigation that was crucial to the plot and was ongoing to it. We kind of talk about that game as that was my first time adopting the cop persona. So I was pushing leads and getting, just the facts, ma'am, and drilling, trying to get us through this campaign. And so for like the next 5 years, I kind of constantly leaned on that persona in most of my characters. And so it was probably just recently in our World of Dungeons where I adopted a new character persona where I finally separated myself out of that, and I came out of that whole cop persona, and I just played this great big dullard of an imbecile, right? He was like a gentle barbarian giant, kind of like, brawn, but like with a heart of gold. And I felt that was probably one of my better successes as a player, is I finally, broke out of what I knew, trying to lead a group using my character traits and just let myself be enveloped in a character.
That's awesome.
Did you enjoy that experience of playing something new, or did it feel like, no, I'm going to go back to the other things that
I loved it.
I was doing because I liked it.
No, I loved it. And I think when we finish our current dungeon crawl, whenever we start our next campaign, I might try and pick up this new character in our next campaign to keep him going forward. I haven't decided that yet, but that's kind of the tentative plan.
Very cool.
As someone who witnessed both of Mike's moments, in that Dusk game, Mike, when all of a sudden we'd been playing 4E for months, it had been combat, fight, encounter. And then all of a sudden you're having conversations with NPCs and character. That was a moment for me too. That was mind blowing. And then years later, when you did something different and broke that and did something else and explored that, was also mind blowing. So I would agree with both of those.
Speaking of trying new things, what is one thing in the world of RPGs that you've wanted to try but have not gotten to try yet?
One thing.
One thing. Pick one. No, I'm just kidding.
I posted a Twitter thread. I think the hashtag is Shelfie. You take a picture of your shelves. Of all of the RPG books that I have, I am a collector of systems. I want to play everything. I talked earlier, I have not played a superhero game and I want to so bad. I want to figure that out. An Eberron game. I talked about that a while ago in our show. I have all these Eberron books. I love the setting. I love the steampunk idea of this fantasy setting with technology powered by elementals. How awesome is that? And I've never played it. I want to, or even run it. A cyberpunk game. In fact, I've wanted to run Vampire for years, and I just started running a little miniature Vampire campaign for Chris and Nathan, and it's so fun. There's a million things I want to try. I can't enumerate them all.
I feel like we have people tell us that about our show too. They're like, "You're just making the problem worse." I'm not sorry. Like,
now I've got to buy another system. This sounds really fun.
There's already a buffet, right? And I can't select one thing on the buffet. I have to eat it all.
Yep.
True story.
Exactly.
True story. For superhero games, I own a bunch. I own Mutants and Masterminds 3rd Edition. I've got the DC Universe, which is basically the same thing. And I looked at masks, I looked at icons. I chose icons. And I did a bunch of icons, bundle of holdings, and I did some sales in icons, and I bought the hardcover book. And then I listened to your masks episodes, and I was like, oh man. And now I've got that on a watch list on Drive-Thru RPG, waiting for it to go on sale.
Oh, Masks is so good.
yeah, I finally got a chance to play it at Gen Con, and it was good. I enjoyed it. What about you, Mike?
So I've got two things that I definitely have on my want to do plate and want to do very recently. So for months now, we've kind of been talking internally about how do we get an actual play started up? What does it look like? How do we approach it? How do we just do an actual play? So I'm really, really hungry to start up an actual play. And then kind of along with that actual play is I want to do a live stream of that actual play, right? So you have your live broadcast, then you have your edited, so you can kind of contrast and compare, and you can interact with your audiences in a couple of different ways through a couple of different platforms.
Yeah, that's very cool. I know Venture Maidens do that, streaming live and then bring an edited version to their podcast stream, and it's just an interesting experience.
It's a lot of work.
Oh yeah, yeah. That's
Everybody I see is like, you love games now. Start an AP and you won't love games.
That's why we haven't started it yet.
Yep.
I like playing on one. I really enjoy playing on one. I don't want to edit it.
Yep. Editing is the part that's hard.
Yeah, I just started those vampire games I mentioned. We recorded those, and I've been editing them. And oh my gosh, there's so much to cut out.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yep.
It's fun.
They're worth it in the end, I think.
What is one lesson in gaming that you are still struggling with?
Mike, intra-party roleplay?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so we identified that as a weakness a few episodes back. We don't, well, I say we, right? I'm the GM usually. Basically every character, every player role plays with me to move the story forward. And we had this huge aha moment on the show talking about our game when suddenly we realized that the players don't role play with each other.
Interesting.
Everyone wants to engage with me to move the plot forward because everyone's interested in the plot.
Mm-hmm.
So I mentioned the three types of games: character, settings, plot, and Martin runs settings. I run plot. Every new session of my games, it's all about what are the three questions I want to pose to the characters? What are the three things that the villains are going to do? What are they responding to? I run a plot-driven game. So I've accidentally encouraged my players to only interact with me and not with each other. Mm-hmm. Mike, anything you want to add to that?
I think we've had a couple of breakthrough moments, right? I think we're finally starting to get to the point where we're interacting with each other more as characters and less as, hey, let's do this cross-table metagame talk to see if we can't figure out what movie plot Dusty's ripping off this time. So we're getting better at it, and I think it was our World of Dungeons game where Nathan and I kind of had a quick breakthrough moment where we had a good interaction with each other, and it really helped drive the plot further than anything we've done in the past where we've tried to milk information out of the DM.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this sort of concept is something that would be really fun to cover on another future character evolution cast episode, actually. Helping players.
Yeah, I think I put it on the list earlier today, actually.
Yeah, saw somebody that just messaged about this on Twitter as we asked the Void what you'd like to see on our advice episodes. And this was actually one of them that was posted there, which is really interesting.
I did not know that when I added this note.
Yeah.
Yeah, we Intra-Party Roleplay featured on our podcast 5 or 10 episodes ago is the first time we thought of it. And we've been sort of toying with it ever since, trying to tease it, figure it out. How do we solve this problem?
Yeah. Yeah, it's
I have so many more questions and so many things that I want to dive into about this, but it's not what this episode is about.
Well, and we're not the experts.
Intra-party conflict is my jam. I love it. I love it so much.
But remember that we're bringing it up because we're bad at it. When you do the episode, do it with folks who are good at it, and we will listen and learn.
So to give you an example, our previous examples of intra-party conflicts has always been, you shouldn't go down there alone. You will die. That was the extent of intra-party conflict. That's how deep it got.
It was all strategy. Yeah, tactics.
It was all tactics, yeah.
Oh, man. Oh, okay. Another time. I just have so many questions. What about for you, Mike? Are you feeling the same way about that's a thing that you're still struggling with, or do you have other things that you're kind of still trying to work out?
So that's definitely the biggest one. For me personally, I think my biggest roadblock is I have a huge case of gamer brain, right? So I've grown up playing video games. I'm pushing 40. I've played video games since I was 4. So getting out of this mode of, all right, I got to put the block on the puzzle block to hit the switch to open the door to get the key that goes to the next level, to get out of that game into a narrative gaming, contributing to a narrative story. That's still my biggest hurdle in RPGs. And that's something I try and work on a little more every time to get myself out of that meta, to get myself out of, figuring out the red herring, figuring out the secret to winning the level, and interacting with people as a character in the universe that the DM has created.
Yeah.
Because that's a thing that you feel like you should do, or because it's a thing that you feel like you want to do?
Both, right? So I think it contributes to the overall enjoyment of the game. If I'm not trying to lead the party by its nose down a corridor that I think is going to be the answer to whatever we're trying to solve, and I'm being a little more collaborative instead of prescriptive, I think that just makes the game better for all the players and the GM too, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. No, I'm trying to remember which kind of fun it is that is the problem solving and the puzzle kind of people that are I can't remember what the term is, but there's one of the 8 kinds of fun that is specifically people who like solving those kinds of puzzles and challenge is what it is. And it's just you strike me as that kind of player that's I need to solve the puzzle. That is the part of it that's fun for you.
It is, but it's not so fun for other people sometimes when I take over. Yeah.
Well,
totally.
And not
that's the hard part.
Not to psychoanalyze Mike, but as his GM, and Mike, I hope you don't mind me saying, I think it's all the fun for you in video games. I think at the table, every time that part of your brain kicks in and you start going down that path, you don't enjoy it. I see frustration on your face.
Yep.
And the moment when you let go and engage with the character and get dramatic, I see you light up.
I'd say that's 100% accurate. And I think that came to light in our Pathfinder campaign where you threw that rogue at us, who it was obvious that he was the villain. It was obvious he was up to ill intent. And no matter what we did to try and prove it wrong, it got shut down. And I think that was the first step into kind of that evolution of how I approach problems and puzzles in games.
I want to talk a little bit too about what is a lesson that you feel like you have learned so far? And like of all of the things that you guys have talked about on your show, what is the most important one that you've taken away?
Around our first 10 episodes, I started with this whole metagaming is okay concept. And I think that was true for a while, but I've moved away from that. No. I'm sorry.
No, I
still think it's true.
Carry on.
I still think it's true. Metagaming is okay. But I've changed that to be a little more focused. This is a specific type of metagaming is okay. And that specific type is, for the love of Pete, be interventionist. And what I mean by that is, if something's not fun, stop it. Move on to something different. I think for new players, it shows up for everyone, and it shows up in lots of different ways. It's an insidious problem. But for new players, and I imagine new players are engaged a lot with content like this, I think it first shows up in getting really bogged down in the minutia of the rules. Mm-hmm. And if you're getting bogged down and you look around the table and no one else is enjoying it, hand wave it, roll a couple of dice. Hey, you know what? You're going to win this combat. It's a foregone conclusion. 15 of the 20 goblins are dead. Let me just roll a handful of d6s to see how many hit points you lose, and let's move on. And the reason I'm emphasizing that is every other art form, writing, even drawing, APs that are edited, movies, they get to edit after the fact. When you're doing live RPG at a table, not for an audience, for yourselves, you have to edit in the moment. So the minute something stops being fun, figure out how to get past it to the next fun thing. Mm-hmm. That's mine.
That's a good one.
That's a really good one. I like that one. And I think we've had moments like that even in recording Shadow of the Cabal too, where Tanner will stop us and say, okay, where are you going with this? It's like, is this leading to something, like to a place that you want to be, or are we just like filling time because we're not sure what else to do? Or, and I think it's okay to ask those questions and just say like, is this important? Like, are you having fun doing it? If you want to have your fun, like a side role play thing because you're enjoying it, that's great. But like, if you're just doing it because you don't know what else to do, it's okay to sort of like have those moments and redirect people and say, okay, let's go over here and do something that is fun. Because ultimately the whole reason that you're there is to enjoy it. So if you're not enjoying it, then like maybe don't do that.
Yeah, I do that as a player in Martin's game. I'll engage Martin by saying, so Martin, I want to figure this out, and I want to figure it out by roughing up a bunch of people in town. I want to go visit all the loan sharks, and I want to turn the tables on them and break their legs and figure out who the shadowy figure is that's running the crime syndicate here in this town so that I can get in their face. Do I get the sense from looking at all this and how big the town is and how many of them there are that that's even possible? And I think it's okay to ask that type of question. And if you have to justify it to yourself, like if you're just starting out, and I think people who are just starting out are really the ones that are most gun shy about metagaming. They really want to keep everything in the universe. If you're gun shy about asking that kind of question, justify it to yourself this way. Your character has the benefit of having their feet on the cobblestones, so to speak, and seeing and hearing and smelling all this information that you don't get to take in. You only get a few words from the GM chooses to share with you. And the GM, having been a GM for many, many years, is not all powerful and all knowing and sharing all the right things. So ask questions. And if you want to limit yourself, then limit yourself to to those questions that your character would know the answer to by virtue of being there and seeing it and hearing it and smelling it.
Mike, what about you? What do you feel like is the biggest lesson that you've taken away?
Actions need consequences. This is something that started coming up in our podcast about, I guess, 4 or 5, maybe 6 episodes now, where one of the big things that I think was missing from our games was that we would do all these crazy things and we'd fail and it wouldn't go right. And it'd be like, okay, well, you failed. All right, try something else. All right, you failed. Try something else. Roll again. And I think it was actually something Dusty picked up from Martin's game that he carried into our game, that when you get those failures, when you get those non-successes, those need to have consequences just as much as your successes do, right? So if you're trying to take pot shots in the dark and you keep missing, then there definitely needs to be a comeuppance for that to keep your players from just taking random shots.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think failure tends to move the plot forward.
Actions having consequences. Powered by the Apocalypse is wonderful for that sort of gameplay because it's literally baked into the rules that failures breed consequences from the GM. which is just such a remarkable twist of it's inferred by the rules that actions have consequences, like in your standard Dungeons and Dragons type of game.
Yeah, that's a big part of where I got it from. So Mike mentioned earlier World of Dungeons for his character where he broke out of being a cop. World of Dungeons is a really pared down, like, I think with character sheets, it's 4 or 5 pages version of Dungeon World, which is, of course, powered by the apocalypse. So I love that roll with consequences, roll without consequences, and that idea of every time you fail, the situation gets worse. You're trying to sweet talk the guard, you don't get to make 15 charisma checks until you get it. The first time you fail one, okay, now the check just got harder because he doesn't like you and he wants you to go away. So everything you do, every time you fail, things get worse until you succeed and then things get better.
My favorite part is you can fail, yet still succeed at your task and then get your comeuppance later.
Yes, and I've used that one quite a bit, failing forward. We often fail forward. Like, well, you got past the guard, but you had to kill him, and he has friends.
We played in a game at Gen Con with Rich Howard, who has been on the show before, too. And the way he phrased it was, if you fail, I will give you exactly what you asked for in a way that makes you wish you never asked for it. And I was like, that is so good. That's so good.
So he literally brings out the monkey's paw.
Jamming note.
Yeah.
Yes. Absolutely.
That's awesome.
And I love that because I think like failure moves stories forward. Like there's no reason, like you need some kind of complexity or problem to solve. Otherwise, like you're all just hanging out. Like you don't read a book that has nothing going wrong. The story doesn't happen that way.
So I routinely introduce new players to gaming. I do it at work. People ask about the hobby, and only if they ask, I will invite them to play a game over lunch that I call Luncheons and Dragons. And it's attracted the following people. Use it, please. People invite other people. We had someone new join the Luncheons and Dragons recently. And the way I explain gaming, and failure is such an important piece of it. The way I explain it is, look, it's like creative writing class in 9th grade when you pair off with someone or a few people and you have to write a tandem story. I write a paragraph, you write a paragraph, you write a paragraph. But what an RPG does is it gives you rules so that one jerk that you're passing around the story with doesn't get to say, well, I kill all the bad guys and I save the president and now I'm a millionaire. Like, well, hang on there, bucko. We need to roll some dice and that might not work out for you.
You can certainly try, but we'll see.
That's what RPGs are. It's a tandem story with rules to keep that one jerk from making his character God.
Now that we know a little bit more about both of you, we are going to get into the really fun stuff. As usual, our goal here is to help people be better players. We try to gear these discussions toward how players, not just GMs, can improve their experiences at the table. We've covered how to make the characters. Now we're going to talk about how to play them.
The end of the year is a time where we tend to reflect on things that have happened over the past year, and we make resolutions for the next year. We usually consider things that we want to change, or we set goals and strategies for meeting those goals. And today we're going to talk about how to bring some of those ideas to the table and resolve to have a better gaming experience.
Yeah, so what do you see as the biggest things that get in the way of people learning from their mistakes, and how can those be improved?
Fear is the short answer. So what breaks our heart the most when we talked about doing RPGLL and putting it out in the world, the thing that we were really fighting was the idea that someone might have a hard time engaging with gaming and then quit and leave the hobby undiscovered, unmined for those gems. So to overcome that, you've really got a game in a safe environment. And what I mean by that, look, gaming's social. Let's just acknowledge that it's a hugely social activity. I'm not saying no one's ever attended their first party in high school alone with no friends as backup, but it's really hard to do that. It's this huge social interaction. You want to have that. You want to have backup. You want to experiment with, interacting with other people, whatever. You want to do that with friends. It'd be really hard to go to your first concert and experience that energy of a live crowd if you don't know anyone there to help you feel like you're comfortable. You're with someone who's going to look out for you. You're with someone who's not going to judge you. But we still constantly encourage people to play their first game of D&D in a game store or online. And those settings can be great, and I'm not knocking them. But if your first game's with a bunch of strangers, that can be a really daunting environment. So if you have to do it, if it's how you have to engage with gaming, if it's your only option, I totally get it. If it's not your only option, I encourage you to seek friends and family who will game with you. In fact, my solution, and Mike is a part of this, he's a casualty of this, is I turned all my really good friends into gamers so that I had a really safe environment to do the goblin voice or the orc voice, or a really safe environment so that I could role play that, 200-year-old but still beautiful elvish queen who's trying to, use her wiles in the characters. I'm a big bearded fellow. And role-playing that takes a safe environment and trusted friends for me to bring that character to life.
Yeah, I absolutely think that that's a huge wall to a lot of people to even getting into it in the first place is you have to know somebody or, we talked about this a little bit before we started about playing video games online and stuff. But as a woman, I'm always very nervous about entering those spaces and because I don't know what I'm getting into. And I resisted playing online for years and years and years. I played with people that I didn't really enjoy playing with because it was that or nothing because I didn't feel comfortable doing it online until I eventually, my first online game happened to be with Tanner. And so that worked out really well for me. But I think that that's a scary thing for a lot of people. And it's tough to kind of encourage people to push their way into that space when it doesn't feel safe or welcome all the time. And I think, that's a really scary thing to get over.
And to specifically tie it back to your feedback question around how can you learn from your mistakes. So now imagine being in that environment with total strangers. Imagine going to your first high school party with no friends, total strangers, and someone tells you, hey, you're doing that wrong.
Ugh.
Yep.
That's not, hey, what are you doing? That's this isn't how you play cups. Or whatever.
I think a lot of it too, right? Especially coming from the player side, is you put yourself in kind of a vulnerable spot when you open yourself up to playing a character, to assuming someone else's role. You're literally doing an improv with strangers for the first time, and that's really hard, and that takes a lot of bravery. So it really does help if you have someone you're already comfortable with, someone you're friends with, to open yourself up like that. And it takes practice to get good at it and to feel less vulnerable.
Well, another point is even veterans that are, in a safe space, they kind of get comfortable in their play style and in the system that they're playing. And maybe they're subconsciously doing something, that is hindering the game without them even realizing it. And they may just pretend that they're not doing anything wrong. And it might be hard for them to get out of their comfort zone and take an objective look at their play style and alter it, since they're so used to being in this particular pocket for years and years and years.
Yeah, and even in that case, that veteran gamer needs to hear that feedback, or it will only feel safe to grow in a place where they trust the feedback that they're getting.
Exactly. So
if I'm having a hard time tying it back to your exact question, what I mean to say is, if you want to learn from your mistakes, first of all, you got to come out of your shell of fully engaging with the game, because you're not going to learn any lessons until you actually engage with the game. So put yourself in a spot where you can engage. Put yourself in a spot where you feel like you can really dive in and play. And then once you do that, you're in that trusted environment, the feedback will come naturally. The ability to, just the comfort level to laugh at yourself when something comes off a little silly. If you try a voice and you're trying this really gravelly Batman voice, and halfway through the session, you have to laugh at yourself because now you can't talk. You need water constantly. You're coughing up a storm. The comfort level to laugh at yourself and say, all right, guys, that didn't work. From now on, my character sounds more like Robin than Batman. Let's just move on. Putting yourself in a place that's that comfortable lets you laugh at yourself and learn the natural way we're all used to learning.
Yeah.
Well, and I think the room to try new things too. I mean, Mike, you talked a little bit about like stepping outside of your comfort zone and trying to play like a different type of character too. And I think that you only have the room to try that out and to let people know how that's working if you feel safe and comfortable with the people around you. That's, you know, I could go into a game and play some character out of left field that's very different from what I normally play. And it could be horrible. And, you know, the people at the table should be able to give me feedback and say, Amelia, maybe don't do that anymore. Like, that really wasn't working. Or like, here's how we think that you could improve it, right? Like, you should be able to, like, as I would want that feedback, because if I'm doing something really horribly, like, help me fix it then, because it's going to be better for everybody.
Right.
So the point I was going to make is almost exactly that, right? So I think one of the reasons I stayed in that, you know, gumshoe persona for so long was because I knew it was working for our games. It allowed the game to progress. We were having an okay time. Sure, I was maybe leading the party to places they didn't want to go, but I at least felt like the party was making some progress as long as I was taking the lead. So it was really a fear that if I started doing something different, maybe our games wouldn't work. Maybe we would just sit around the table and be like, well, I don't know. What do we do? So I think there is a lot of fear that, you know, what I'm doing works. Do I risk trying doing something new and just completely break the game?
Big honesty moment. Big honesty question for you, Mike. Did you ever resent being the one that had the responsibility of and the role of driving the plot forward always?
I'm going to answer that by saying, in the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles game, you made me Leonardo for a reason.
I did. Can a GM and a player have a codependent relationship where
Yes.
the GM leans on that one player? Yes. I leaned on Mike, and it wasn't good for the game. And I have since made amends, I hope.
You have. And it's worked out very well.
But those are the kinds of discussions that you want to have too, because I think that can put players in an awkward position too, of being like, I don't want to be the one that's constantly having to decide where we're going to go next. Or, you know, I mean, even I've played in games too where it's, you know, one of my fellow players is in that position of always being the one saying, okay, next we're going to go here. And it's like, either there are times when that's not fun because I don't want to make the decisions, or there are times where when I'm not the one making those decisions that I'm really bummed because I feel like I am not in charge of the story at all, you know?
So Tanner from Shadow of the Cabal, I'm assuming all of your listeners know who Tanner is, but
He's been on the show.
Yeah, he has experienced that firsthand with me, where Mike, when Tanner GM'd us through the Holy Matrimony, Tanner's original adventure, I wound up hugely driving it, and the whole time I'm like, is it okay that I'm doing this? Like, are Mike and Brian mad? I was totally taking the lead and feeling pretty awkward about it the whole time, but unable to stop myself.
And we were totally cool with it too. We had no problem with that whatsoever.
I think it's cool to have like out of game moments too, though. Like that's where some of that metagaming comes in too, is that it's okay to step back and say, is everybody cool with this? Are we still having fun? Do you want to say, you know, like, do you want to do something? Or, you know?
Yeah. And we did. And Tanner laughed at us the whole time. In a good way.
That's because he's a jerk.
In a good way. No.
Take that, Tanner.
In a good way.
I want to ask you guys, as people who have been doing this for a while and have, you know, covered a lot of your own games, do you feel like there are common mistakes that a lot of people are making?
I'd say beginner mistakes. Yeah, the biggest beginner mistake is taking the wrong pieces way too seriously and totally ignoring the right pieces. So it's really easy to let yourself say, gosh, D&D is hard. To play D&D, if I look at Amazon, there's like 25 books and I don't know what to buy. Do I have to memorize all this stuff? Do I have to know all this? What if I forget what a perception check is? Is everyone going to laugh at me? And you feel like you have to memorize this entire rule set, and that becomes your focus, and it's the wrong thing to focus on. Therein does not lie the fun. The fun lies in, you know, asking yourself and the other players at the table, hey, what does success look like? I feel like at my job, and we often at RPGLL relate things back to work, we pay consultants crazy money to come in and ask us the same questions over and over again. And one of those things is start off every meeting at work with, okay, at the end of this meeting, what does success look like? What will we have achieved? What are we going to walk out of this meeting with? Do the same thing at your table. And that's the important piece to focus on, not what your passive perception is. So focus on the right stuff. Mike?
So yeah, kind of thinking along that takes me back to like one of our very, very, very first games when you kind of pulled us into this whole RPG D&D world. And one of the things that stuck out with that game was, I was very familiar with character stats and attributes and min-maxing and all that before I started RPGs through, video game RPGs, how to properly assign stats. But Dusty had pre-made characters for us since this was our very first time. He wanted to make it as easy as possible. And he had created a ranger that I selected for my character. And as we started playing, I started noticing that, my ranger wasn't very good at things like shooting an arrow or being very dexterous because he had a bunch of points sunk into charisma, which isn't a necessarily bad thing, but it probably doesn't make the greatest ranger. He had a very, very low dex, very high charisma. And I think the thing that made that kind of stick out in my brain, though, is that didn't matter to the overall enjoyment of the game. We had a great time. We told a great story. There were heroic moments. There were epic moments. There were sad moments. And I think that exemplifies exactly what Dusty's saying. When you spend too much time focusing on what you think the right things are, sometimes you miss the most important part, which is having fun, having a good time, telling a good story with your friends.
Yeah, I got that so wrong.
You totally did.
So wrong. And in my head, I was like, well, the party's got to have a leader. And in the D&D cartoon, that was Hank. And Hank, leaders have high charisma. And charisma is really important in BioWare RPG video games. Mm-hmm. So the front man of the party's got to have a really high charisma, right?
Right.
And I was so wrong, and it so didn't matter.
So just a postscript to that, the way we resolve the main conflict in that is me as a ranger, I ultimately had to shoot a horse with the arrow because it was the only thing I could hit.
That is a true story. And I want, if you're listening and you have not engaged with an RPG yet because you're worried about learning all the rules, you'll get that eventually. But you got to jump in and play that first session. Mm-hmm. Rules aside, to heck with the rules. Mm-hmm. Darn the rules, full speed ahead, and play that first session because ultimately the rules are not the fun part.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I playing on an AP. We just finished playing Genesis, and every single session, probably twice per session, I would say, wait a second, how do I roll initiative? And Tanner would groan at me and say, Amelia, come on now. And I'd be like, I don't remember. And it's like, I do this, not professionally, but like regularly. I have no clue. I don't know. Yeah. I'm sure it's in there somewhere. Someone will tell me what I need to know. I show up.
So Brian's not on the show, so this is the only moment where I'll straight out tease him. Mike, 4th edition D&D, all those power cards. Ugh. Brian was a fighter, and he had 1 million power cards in front of him. But what did he do every single turn?
I swing my sword.
Basic attack. Basic attack.
Yep.
Like, Brian, don't you want to go into this stance and for the love of God do a power strike?
No, I swing my sword.
No. What's worse is he would be like, can I do that? Like, the card's right there. Again, It didn't matter. He had a great time. He played a character based on Inigo Montoya from The Princess Bride. He played it to the hilt, and he loved the heck out of that game, despite never once having done Power Strike, which was his main power attack.
Yeah. Well,
if you're having fun,
Absolutely. Yes. The RPG Academy family of shows, if you're having fun, you're doing it right.
Yep.
There you go.
It's funny because I'm a computer programmer by trade. So my basic philosophy when it comes to programming is 90% logic, 10% syntax. If you take that and paraphrase it a little bit, role-playing games are 90% characters and story, 10% rules.
I really like that analogy.
Yeah.
You don't have to know the rules in order to enjoy the game, as long as you're telling a good story with the characters that you have.
So in my organization, I was a business relationship manager in IT. And then I was a software engineering manager that actually led a team of developers. And I've done stuff before that. I've been a developer. I've had a fairly long career. But I'm back on the business, and I find myself back on the business because I can have the most impact on a program at work by laying out all the requirements and the business logic and being a strong business owner. A strong business owner is so much more important than a strong IT partner because you can't automate a bad process. Well, knowing all the rules is not going to help you tell a fun story. You have to start story first and let the rules support that.
Yep, exactly. Well, sometimes we can be blind to our own mistakes and failures. What is the value of, and how do we implement the idea of an honest self-review?
Ooh, honest self-review. Those are big words. And it seems daunting. It really seems daunting at first. But once you flip the script, it becomes so easy. And you'll get eager for the feedback. You'll become greedy for the feedback. And to do that, you got to flip the script. You're not focusing on your failures. You're not asking everyone to point out every flaw and blemish in everything you did. What you're asking them for are ways to get better. You've got to put yourself in this continuous improvement mindset. Have a positive mental outlook on what you're asking your players to give you. And you really will become incredibly eager for that next outside observation that helps you optimize your game. Your game becomes a craft that you care about. And everything everyone gives you that helps you improve it is appreciated and amazing. And your outlook toward feedback totally changes. You can be really resilient in the face of feedback if you look at feedback as a way to legitimately improve your craft and storytelling.
I would also follow up that to say is you have to sometimes really pry feedback out of people. I know when Dusty started asking for feedback from us as a group, it was probably at least a good 6 to 9 months before we actually started giving him valuable feedback he could use because we were afraid of offending him, right? He was spending all this time to make a game for us. And the last thing you want to do is be like, well, you know, that part that you spent a lot of time figuring out what that NPC would do, that wasn't so great. But I think as we got a little more comfortable sharing that feedback, it allowed him a little more easier to do that honest self-review because we're giving him honest feedback. So there really is a timetable there into setting up that good communication.
I think that's a thing that we talked about in our session 0 episode too, is that sort of like setting that expectation of here's the feedback I'm going to give and here's the feedback that I want from you. Like sort of setting that stage right away before you start a campaign too, of saying, these are, you know, I expect that you're going to give this to me and I want you to understand that like, this is a valuable part of this interaction. And I want you to tell me things that aren't going right because that's the only way that I can fix them is to know that they're wrong.
Yeah.
And similarly, I want to know what things are going right because I want to be able to do more of that then if that's a thing that people are enjoying.
Yeah. And for our listeners out there, if you're in the middle of a long running campaign and you never had that session 0, it's okay to take a pause and have a session 0 in the middle of your campaign to go over some of these basic ground rules that will help allow the players and the GM to provide feedback in a very safe and welcoming sort of way.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with session 121.5.
Yeah.
Absolutely. One thing I want to talk about too is how to give advice, because I think sometimes it's important to take a look at what things are constructive and what things are not, and how we can kind of incorporate that so that, like I said, it becomes a norm in the game. That like, you know, how do we set up a situation where we want to give advice to people and we're okay getting it?
Yeah, to give advice, look for the cue. I'd say that your GM's ready for it. I end sessions with a call for feedback. And as a GM, I'll specifically call out the things that I thought went well or that I thought could have gone better to open the floodgates for the players. Look for that cue from your GM. If they don't give the cue, that doesn't mean you don't give feedback. But if I'm saying these words and you're like, oh, my GM does at the end of every session say this thing, and we usually gloss over it and say, great game, man, while we grab a handful of Doritos on the way out the door, recognize that as an opportunity to jump in with your feedback. So look for the right moment. Giving feedback can feel daunting, especially if you have this huge burning issue that you want to cover. Look for the opening to give it. And I wouldn't worry in giving feedback about having too many specifics ready. I think of giving feedback, I'm going to use the analogy boxing match, but if you're not that combative, think of it as just more of a two-way street or a conversation. Ask yourself, when's the last time someone unloaded a 10-minute monologue on you? And how much of that did you listen to? And how quickly did you tune out? It's really easy to tune out. Don't be the guy giving that monologue. Instead, give a thoughtful piece of feedback. Maybe don't worry about specifics in the first nugget that you give. Hey, any feedback from the game? Yeah, the NPC that we met in the market, the clown who was a failed juggler, really didn't click with me. And leave it at that. And then it's a two-way street. Wait for them to process it. Wait for them to think about it, and wait for them to signal that they're ready for you to continue by saying, well, what do you mean? What didn't you like? And then give them something else. Let them process it. Let them ask. Think of it as this two-way street. If you unload a 10-minute monologue on how actually your uncle was a circus performer and it totally broke the realism of the moment because you knew that that's not really how juggling worked, and it was this huge game-breaking moment for your verisimilitude, I hate to say it, less than a minute, less than 15 seconds into that monologue, they've stopped listening. They're waiting for you to be done talking so they can try to figure out what you mean. Leave some air in that conversation. Let them draw it out of you. Let it be a two-way street. It keeps them engaged in what you're saying, and it lets you read the situation to your maximum comfort. If they're, a little taken aback by the feedback, you've said a few things, you can back off and make it a compliment sandwich by pulling back and saying, hey, but this part of the game was great. Mm-hmm. And let them sit on it, process it, think about it, and bring that gesture and his incorrect juggling back up on their own time. Mm-hmm. So don't worry about giving this incredibly well-reasoned legal argument with specific examples and point A and point B and all this. Don't unload that on someone right out of the gate. Mm-hmm. Put some air in the conversation. Let them process. Let them think. Let them explain themselves. Have you had this experience? I know I have. I've started giving feedback, and they tell me what they were doing, and I'm like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Forget everything I was going to say because I thought that NPC was doing something totally different that I wasn't cool with. But actually, now I'm good. Leave yourself some room to learn during that conversation, just as you want them to learn. Mm-hmm. The only real don't I'd give around sharing feedback is don't give feedback in absolutes. Don't give feedback, hey, you're doing this wrong. Hey, this was just wrong. This was incorrect. Unless you are an incredible authority on whatever that subject is, absolutes probably don't have a lot of room in your dramatic conversation that takes place in a fantasy world in which dragons are, a routine part of your experience. Mm-hmm. So yes. Don't throw out absolutes. Other than that, don't worry about it being actionable. Don't worry about it being specific. Throw it out. Let it sit. Have the conversation. This is not a workplace conversation. This is not a professional conversation. This is not a legal argument. This is sharing something really personal, watching to see how it's taken, and then growing together as two people.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that the idea of it being a conversation is really important, that nobody likes to have somebody stand in front of them and say, here's a list of things that I think that you did wrong. You need that room to say, this thing maybe didn't work for me. What can we do to kind of work through that and maybe make it different next time? Or again, like you said, for you to say, well, actually, here's what I was going for. And for me to say, I totally missed that point, that was on me and not on you at all.
Yeah. Leave air in the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And not all feedback has to be bad, of course. Telling something that the GM or the player did that they normally don't do that you loved is a great way to positively reinforce that sort of behavior. If a player is silently going out on a limb and trying something that they've never tried before and they get nothing back from it, even if it was amazing, they might not do that again. They might think, oh, well, that probably fell flat because it wasn't nobody commented on it. You know, we're talking about all this cool stuff afterwards about the plot, but nobody commented about my character hang gliding, you know, 1,000 feet down the cliff face to save this person or whatever. Even though my character is a total introvert. It's definitely positive reinforcement of the good things, and then an honest discussion about the negative things is definitely required when you're looking to give feedback and accept feedback as well.
Yeah, I mentioned it earlier, but at work we openly talk about the compliment sandwich. Hey,
Yeah,
this was awesome.
we do that one a lot too.
Yep. This was
great.
awesome. I'd like to see a little bit more work here, but this other thing was also great. Sorry, Mike.
I was just going to say to Ryan's point, I think as a player, what's even more important there is actively seeking feedback, right? Because the only time you normally get feedback as a player is either A, you blew up the game, or B, you stepped all over something someone else wanted to do. And that's the only time someone's really going to approach you. So I think you really do have to, reach out to your other players, reach out to your GM, is what I'm doing, does that work? Does it feel true to my character? Am I stepping on the game? So I think just being out there and asking for it is a big deal. And I'll be honest, that's something we do not do at all in our current games of Dusty. And I feel terrible about it sometimes. So I think that's probably going to be one of my goals for this year, is to start actively seeking feedback.
And I think it's important to kind of bring it back around to the player side of things, that as a player, it's good to seek that feedback. And as a GM, it's good to give that feedback to your players too, because this is a collaborative experience. And there are generally, in almost all cases, more players than there are GMs in a game. And it's important that their participation be of quality as well. And so I think that, I, as a player, really love when my GM says, hey, I really liked this thing that you did, but hey, maybe next time, remember that this other character is the face of the group, so don't try and talk over them all the time or whatever. Like, I want that kind of feedback so that I know that I'm helping to make this experience good for everybody, because that shouldn't always be on the GM to moderate the experience and make things great for everyone. As a player, that's part of your job too.
Exactly. And as players and other fellow players talking after the game, we talked a little bit about this in our Session Zero and Safety episodes. When you're processing the game that you had played, it's perfectly fine to have conversations with each other afterwards. And if you're not comfortable asking for feedback at the table, and maybe you're more comfortable asking for it, behind a text screen or over the phone, or maybe just one-on-one over lunch or something like that with one of your best friends at the table. You don't have to make it a public ask, as long as the ask is there. Yeah,
absolutely. Because I think that there's, especially when there is like some kind of negative feedback or something like that too, sometimes you just want to do that one-on-one. Like, I don't want to be called out publicly. And I know I've had those moments too in games where I've talked to a GM and said, hey, this thing didn't really work for me. I don't want to make a big deal out of it, or I don't want to say it in front of everybody or whatever. But like, just so you know, this is an issue that I was kind of noticing. And sometimes having those conversations one-on-one without the outside noise is a little bit easier too.
Yeah, very true.
I wanted to bring back one point too about like the difference between constructive feedback and critical feedback too, because I think that that's really important, is that not all feedback is equal. There are things that people will tell you that sometimes you can just say, okay, thanks, and then move on to the next thing. Like, not everything is applicable to you, and not everything is always something that you need to fix. It might be like a personal preference. And I think, like, I don't know if you guys have advice on how to kind of recognize the difference between those and how to help people make sure that their feedback is constructive versus critical.
I do, but it's kind of here's the difficult part about that, is you don't want to stifle feedback.
No.
And it's really easy to let the constructive critical thing turn into, okay, well, I guess my feedback has to meet these criteria before I can say it, even though all I know about why I didn't like it is that I felt icky. And maybe that doesn't feel constructive to me. And now I've got to get into all this other stuff. The only piece I would push to say, make sure it's actionable, or make sure it's specific, make sure it's constructive, is as long as you're not speaking those absolutes, as long as you're not saying what you did was wrong, as long as you're honestly speaking from your experience about how whatever happened affected you, then it's legitimate feedback. And it's constructive feedback, and it's actionable, and it's all those things because you're talking about your experience with that part of the game and not this absolute abstract concept that supposedly this person's violating. So with constructive feedback and not constructive feedback, I don't try to stifle. And I don't try to stifle, and I've rarely had not constructive feedback that there wasn't ultimately something there that I needed to think about.
One other thing first is just that as far as like the difference in those kinds of feedback, I think the one big thing I personally would say is to make sure that that feedback is directed at the situation and not at the person. So that it's very much like, here is a thing that happened or a thing that you did that I didn't like, that it is not about your ability to GM a game. It is this particular scenario that I didn't like or something like that, so that you aren't criticizing who they are as a person or how, it should be about the situation and about the thing that you want to give the feedback about, not the person you are giving the feedback to.
Yeah, that's 100% true.
Yep. I think one of the things I do when I try to give, Dusty specifically feedback as a DM is I think about what was fun, what wasn't so fun, what felt well-paced, what felt like good plot. And if I have feedback, I try to pose it as, this part of the game was really great. This is why it felt wonderful. We slowed down in here because I thought A, B, C, D, the reasons that might have been that. I think another thing that I try to do and I give to Dusty is, things that were good, maybe what would be a way to do it is better if he runs this campaign again. And, I'll pose it in ways as, this is really great and I love the way it turned out, but how crazy would it have been if we did blah, 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 blah. And just kind of phase it as, what would make it more engaging if we had to do it again.
So, Mike, your comment, especially on the heels of Amelia's comment, crystallized something for me just now that both of you have brought together that has not occurred to me, is not in the notes. We talk about our game, Mike, as if it's a TV show.
Yeah.
We refer to our game almost like we're the production staff on a TV show. And, hey, how do you think our game went? How do you think tonight's episode was? And we've gotten really mature about giving and getting feedback in that way, where the game is this disembodied product that isn't personal. It doesn't feel personal. And we can really talk about the game as if it exists separately from ourselves, recognizing the feedback as our contributions to that game. But you're right, Amelia, not saying, the TV show equivalent of, we've really got to can this actor. He's not doing it. No, it's more, tonight's episode, this character suffered, and I think it's because of these things, and here's what we can do to portray that character in a more positive light. It's situational, and again, not absolute, and to your point, not ad hominem, not to the person.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I think one of the things that I was just thinking about was it's kind of, if you approach your games kind of like most people approach playtesting games at, say, like a convention or something like that, where that the developer of the game is for sure wanting feedback at the end of the session, positive and negative, so they can improve the development of the game. If you go at it at that mindset, saying my game master or my players want to get the best out of this story, they want the best for their characters. How can we do that? Well, if you approach it by figuring out what worked and what didn't work and then fix it for next time, and then go with the same exact mentality of what worked, what didn't work, eventually you're just going to keep getting better and better and better and better. And you're going to have this absolutely amazing experience with everybody at the table.
Yeah, like you're playtesting your own campaign.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And by the way, for those at home, what Ryan's talking about, and I know he knows this is foundational to agile software development. It's foundational to so many things where Mike and I work, where we're doing constant postmortems. How did this go? How can we do it better? How did it go? How can we do it better?
Sprint retros.
And there are whole ceremonies in Agile, Scrum, Kanban, whatever. There are whole ceremonies around this concept of, make sure you're noting these pieces of feedback to give in the retro at the end of the sprint.
Yeah.
Jot down this piece of feedback during the game to give in the retro at the end of the session.
Yeah. And it's good to have action items. It's great to have feedback, but feedback without actionable items based upon that feedback is less valuable, I would say. Less valuable than, having all of this stuff like in a list saying, okay, this was bad. Why was it bad? How can we fix it for next time? This was great. How was it great? How can we keep on doing this for next time?
And that's what our show does for us. It's I really do want to model positive, a positive model of giving feedback and receiving feedback for those that listen to us. And I want people to learn from our experiences so that they don't have to make our same mistakes. But the show also serves, frankly, a rather selfish purpose of being our retros, where we do document those things so that we can see those trends personally for our game. And I really believe our show has made our game a whole lot better.
Oh, yeah.
I have to say, from listening to your show, because I ran the retrospective after the first season of Shadow of the Cabal, and then Caleb asked me to run the one at the end of the second season of Sounds Like Crows, and I listened to several of your episodes to kind of pull some of those questions, and those were really solid discussions that we had that I know moving forward in both cases are things that kind of brought to light some things that people hadn't really thought about or, wanted to work toward for next time. And in both cases, we sat down and said, here are the things that went really well and that we were really excited about. And here are the things that we want to try next time. And here are the things that maybe won't do again because they just didn't really go anywhere. And those are really solid conversations to have. And I would love for people outside of you guys and outside of AP podcasting to be sitting down and having those conversations about their campaigns.
Okay, so we talked a lot about giving feedback and good tips on how to give feedback. We talked a little bit about how you can receive feedback. Can we dive a little bit deeper into the receiving end of feedback for a little bit?
So I don't know how everyone feels about Warren Buffett. And I don't love everything he says, and I'm tired of the headlines about Warren Buffett calling for economic collapse next month. Read this article now. But
that said,
so I'm not a fan of the cult of Warren Buffett. Having said that, if you're going to Google and read anything about it, read about Warren Buffett's feedback as a gift model. And I love the idea. It's such a simple mental change to instill in yourself is to truly treat feedback as a gift. Hey, it's Christmas time. It's that holiday season, Hanukkah, Christmas, etc. And we've all accepted gifts from people, and you open it up, and it's something you already have. It's not something that you wanted. It's not something that you need. But you're always gracious. You're still thankful. You appreciate it. Treat feedback that way. That's what treat feedback as a gift means. You would never... If someone gives you feedback and you think that they're wrong, we find ourselves very willing to say, no, you misunderstood. You're wrong. But if we get a gift that's ill-timed, ill-placed, we already have it, we do not do that. Use that gift thinking on the feedback. Because every time you tell someone they misinterpreted or you rebuff the feedback, you rebuff the gift, you're making that person not want to buy presents for you anymore. You're making them not want to give you feedback. Treat that feedback like it's a present. The first words out of your mouth are thank you. I appreciate, honestly, just that you thought of me and that you're willing to give me this. I appreciate this feedback that you're bringing to me. I appreciate that you think well enough of the game and take it seriously enough to even offer this. And you know what? I have questions for you. So the second part of Warren Buffett's advice is, number one, never turn feedback away. Always say thank you. Always accept the feedback. Hey, I appreciate it. And then ask questions, not to be defensive, but ask questions about their experience. Take a moment and phrase your question in as short a way as you can so that it's not defensive. Open the floor for them to talk. Let them talk. The other part of treating feedback as a gift, and Amelia, you touched on this earlier, and I sort of glossed over it, and I didn't mean to, so I'm coming back to it now.
Oh, no.
You're right. Sometimes that feedback goes on a shelf. Sometimes someone buys you a banana juicer, and nobody drinks
A
banana
hot dog
juice.
slicer.
A hot dog slicer. And it sure was sweet of them to think of you because they know you love hot dogs. And you're going to thank them for it. And it's going to go on your shelf and you're never going to touch it. Mm-hmm. You might put it out. It's a gift. You can put it on the shelf, or it can become an integral part of your life if someone does hit you with that gift that really nails the situation. All the guilt of getting a present like a banana juicer that you're not going to use because they spent money on it, that goes away because this feedback costs nothing. Mm-hmm. Leaving the door open for them to give you more feedback costs nothing. There's no guilt here. Treat it as a gift. Be gracious about it. And then to Amelia's point, decide what you're going to do with it. And I know I'm monologuing here and I apologize. One other point that I would make, don't respond right away. I have, at a game con, when I ran Terror on the Kataro, which is my original adventure that I really love. It's my, holy matrimony, to use Tanner as an example. I ran the game and I got feedback that there wasn't a lot of variety of enemies. And I thought, well, you were on a boat at sea. I don't know what you were expecting, was what I thought. It's not what I said. I was very gracious out loud, and I was a jerk in my head. Yep. And thank goodness I was gracious out loud, because over the next couple of weeks, it kept coming back up, and I kept thinking about it, and I thought of ways to address it. And it doesn't really cost me anything except for a little bit of time to address it. Mm-hmm. It's a concern someone brought to me. And in thinking about it, I could see where over a 3-hour con game, it might have gotten a little monotonous to just fight poachers and, well, I don't want to give away the plot to Terra the Kataro, but the other bad guys, the other antagonists. And, if you are gracious and accepting the feedback and not being defensive, you don't have this weird pride battle when 2 weeks later you're like, you know what, that actually was a good point, and I am going to take their feedback even though I was a huge jerk. Mm-hmm. So flip that script in your head. Think of feedback like a gift. Always say thank you. Always accept it. Always be gracious. Leave that door open, and I think you'll make people want to give you more feedback. Mm-hmm.
I think, taking that moment to step away and think about it too is really important, because I think a lot of times our gut feeling when anybody says anything kind of negative is, no, of course not me. I don't know. What are you talking about? It's fine. And I think that if you have that response right away, there's the tendency to not even file it away for later. And so, I think that if Ryan had come to me and said, hey, Amelia, I don't like this thing that you did. And I was like, whatever, Ryan. And then I would think nothing of it ever again. And I think that if you take a minute and say thank you and kind of pause, it forces you to not have that knee-jerk reaction and then just throw it away. Like you have to hold on to that a little bit and process it too, and come back to it later and say, was this worthwhile? Did I maybe need to fix something here? Mm-hmm. You have that opportunity to kind of like let it sink in a little bit rather than just like brushing off the surface right away.
Mm-hmm. Mike?
I think the only thing I really have to add to that, so I think you absolutely killed it. And I'm going to work really, really hard to try to remember what you said when I start actively seeking feedback as a player.
Noted. And hey,
we'll hold you to it.
Awesome.
To quote LeVar Burton, don't take my word for it. Go find the article and read it. I think you'll find it worthwhile.
Yeah, I'll try and put it. I'm going to make a note to myself to put that in the show notes, actually. What are some main areas that you think focusing on mistakes or failures can be particularly helpful? When we sit down and look at our game, are there specific areas that kind of we can narrow it down to? Because I think asking for feedback can feel really overwhelming. And I know that as a player, when my GM has come to me and said, hey, what did you think? That's a really broad question, right? And so sometimes I think our inability to give that feedback is just based on being like, I don't even know where to start. So are there specific areas that we can kind of focus on that make giving and receiving that feedback a little bit easier?
Externalize. Definitely externalize. It's so easy to start feedback off by saying, hey, what did you guys think of this system? Externalize the adventure. Even if you wrote it. Hey, what did you think of the adventure? Not, what did you think of my adventure? Not my game. What did you think of this adventure? If it's a module, then even better. You can hold up the module And people aren't giving feedback to you. They're giving feedback to this disembodied third party that's not going to get offended, so they feel free to do it. The system's not going to get offended. The module's not going to get offended. Mm-hmm. So those are really safe places to begin your feedback journey. Mike?
Yeah, I would have to say that for me personally, I think in the past we've gotten the most, the most juice for the squeeze when we really focus on that pacing, the pacing of the story and how the narrative is going, right? So as long as we feel like the story is moving at an appropriate pace and that no one's getting bored and no one's getting disengaged, I think that's where we've always been the most effective. And I think almost everything comes secondary to that narrative, to that pace, right? So if your players are playing out your character, it's contributing to the story. If your characters are following the plot, it's contributing to the story. So I think everything's kind of central to that, or that's central to everything, and everything else revolves around that.
To tie the pacing thing in, Mike, I think a huge breakthrough for me when I first started asking for feedback way back in the days of D&D 4E was when I started saying things like, hey, I noticed we spent a lot of time on this. How was that? And if you avoid adjectives like boring, if you avoid adjectives like monotonous, if you avoid those adjectives that can be offensive or annoying or hurtful, if you avoid the adjectives and you just talk about the time spent with a minimal of just modifiers and flowery language, it really helps a good, practical, constructive conversation.
Mm-hmm.
I'd agree with that.
That's a really good point, because I think back on some of the issues that I've had with games that we've played before, and I think a lot of it kind of does come back to, okay, we spent a long time doing this thing, and mentally my process is, where did that get us? So did we spend a long time doing that thing because it was something that we were really into and we just wanted to keep doing that? Like, were we in this scene because we were having fun and we were just goofing around and having a good time with it? Or were we continuing to be in this scene because we didn't know how to get out of it, or we couldn't beat whatever the bad guy was? Like, talking about the pacing of things is a really good way to frame that, because I think that almost all of my feedback for a game that did or did not work centered around, why did we spend so long doing this thing?
And I'm looking up a specific episode of our show where we get really into talking about time spent. And that is the episode where we talked about the goal.
Yep. Because time spent was, I believe, our primary currency and our primary measure of success for playing games. So if it felt like we were optimizing time spent, that basically we weren't feeling like we were wasting our time, then we were being successful in what we were doing.
That's a really interesting way not a way that I would have thought of measuring how things went, but I think that that's a really good point because it doesn't matter what your group's particular idea of time well spent is. Like, that's not a thing that you have to say, like, we spent this much time in combat or this much time on inter-party roleplay or whatever. But just to say, like, was it time well spent is a really easy metric that I think almost everybody can latch onto and say yes or no. And then why.
Right.
And if you're looking for a way to do what Ryan and I were talking about earlier and really carve your game down to the minimum with all this feedback and use this methodology of getting better and better and better with retros. The theory of constraints, the goal, looking at time spent as your currency, as your inventory, as your throughput, and looking at time spent as that's reading to optimize. I bet if you think about your game right now, and it's really not just time spent, Amelia, it's the GM's time. Anything that takes up the GM's time slows the game down. Freeing the GM's time up moves the game forward. And the whole table, when the GM is spending time on something, the whole table feels idle. So we feel like we've all spent our time on this. If one player is spending time looking something up while the GM moves the plot forward, no one else feels that. So it's really the GM's time that you're talking about with that. And it's a huge and powerful way to talk about process improvement and continuous improvement and get feedback without making it personal.
Yeah, I really like that idea of like looking at that as your currency for how your game is going. That's a really good idea.
I want to refer back to that episode of our show so badly because it's one of the episodes I'm the most proud of.
So actually, I Google searched it. If you Google RPGLL the goal as 3 different words, it'll actually come up as the first result. It's RPG Lessons Learned episode 40, brainstorming on the goal, the theory of constraints.
Awesome.
And I'll put a link to it in our show notes too for people.
Thank you so much. We're really proud of that episode where we talk about, what is the constraint to gaming, and the constraint is the GM's attention is ultimately where we landed. Mm-hmm. And it's just an interesting process improvement way to look at your games in a completely different light.
Yeah, I love that a lot.
I think another area for me in playing games that tends to come up in things that aren't working are there are times when the system itself is getting in the way of what you're trying to do. There are sometimes like rules that are really clunky or that are like your understanding of them is getting in the way too. And I feel like that's another one of those areas of feedback that you can give that doesn't feel personal. It is not my GM's fault that, 4th edition L5R has this terrible rule for whatever. Like that's,
everything Heroes Unlimited.
Or Heroes Unlimited is a bad game. Like that's not Ryan's fault. But that's another area of feedback that you can kind of say, like, how can we improve this? Are there house rules that we can implement? Or is there even something that my GM can do to help me understand it? Because sometimes, I'll be honest, it is a matter of my inability to process things. Like I should have grasped how initiative works by now. But I think that's another area that you can kind of talk about and say, is this slowing us down? Is there a better way to do this, or a way that we can change it or adjust it, or again, just help people understand better so that things move forward a little easier?
So I was going to say my solution to that is by having a GM who loves to kickstart campaigns and systems. So he has this huge shelf of campaign and system rules. So when we feel like one system just isn't working, we just switch. We just switch. We've played like 20 different systems in like the last 3 years.
I can't recommend anything more for Amelia, exactly that situation when you're looking for a house rule. If you've played a bunch of systems, it's so easy to lift rules out of other systems. So playing a lot of different systems so that you have a broad toolbox is really important. And I'm going to pile onto your feedback, Amelia. Mike, we have a gaming opinion that is not very popular in the gaming world, especially in the podcast world.
Ooh, yes. I love unpopular opinions.
Yes, it's kind of a sacred cow. We really did not enjoy our experience with Savage Worlds one bit.
Yeah.
Hey, Savage Worlds is a dumb system.
Yay, someone else who agrees with me. Thank you.
We did Deadlands with a couple of people from Sounds Like Crows, and I walk away, and I was like, I don't know about this.
Yeah, so it's so many people love it that I'm not willing to go that absolute, to pull in the conversation from earlier, and say it's just bad. What I will say, to make it situational to your earlier comments, is it's really bad online.
Yeah.
Savage Worlds is so based on these tactile elements. The deck of cards.
I wondered about that. Like, how do you do the cards? Like,
Yeah.
it doesn't. Yeah, a lot of those like peripheral things are really like paramount to your experience of that game, and I don't like. And I think Phoenix Dawn Command is another game too that like it would probably be really fun, but I have no idea how you play it online.
Yeah. And games like Apocalypse World that aren't based on a lot of stuff. There's no things that you're handing out. They work really, really well online. So I think it's okay to talk about a system, especially in the context of your game. So it isn't that Mike and I think that Savage Worlds is a terrible system that no one should play. It's that we think you should think twice before you play it online. And at a minimum, make sure you have the digital tools set up, or the alternate rules for initiative, which is a deck of playing cards in Savage Worlds. Have that ready to go so that you either modify the system to meet your situation, or you just play a different system to meet your situation.
Yep.
Yes. Oh man, you took me back to the game sessions with my friends back in high school, trying to fix Heroes Unlimited because it was all that we knew. It was this is what we play. We've got 30 to 50 books in the Palladium system at our fingertips, and the rules are for the most part garbage. and figuring out, because they have rules for everything. It was a 90s game. They have rules for absolutely everything. And you can't wrap your head around all of that. So having little house rules for things like to make grappling easier. Grappling's a huge example that a lot of people don't like in D&D and in the Palladium systems. But you can easily house rule that with cues from other games. Very, very simply to interject that into your own games.
Absolutely. As much as we loved World of Dungeons, we were able to quickly, thanks to our broad experience with a lot of systems and based our ability and willingness to give feedback and talk about things and explore it, we very quickly landed on we loved everything about World of Dungeons except the wizard. Magic in World of Dungeons is really hard to conceptualize, manage, wrap your head around. In a rules light system, it needs just a few more rules because it's so open. But yeah, the broader your experience is with systems and the more willing you are to call out the system in the situation, yeah, really good feedback, really good gaming growth can result from that.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a key point too, is that remembering that like not everything is for everyone. This is a point that I make on our show all the time too, is that, you know, not everything is right for every situation. Not everything is enjoyable to every person. There are lots of people that love playing Savage Worlds, and I'm sure that there are probably plenty of people even that like playing it online, but like that wasn't right for the experience that you were curating in that particular game. And that's okay. There are plenty of times where I think, because you guys talked about it on your show at one point too, that like, didn't you try playing L5R in like a different system too, and it didn't quite work because that's not what it was meant for. Yeah. And so not everything is right for every situation, and that is a valuable part of feedback too, is like looking at how did this work? How can we adjust it to make it work for what we're trying to do as well? Yeah.
And be willing to recognize that not every tool is great for every job. You might completely love L5R 4E, but now imagine if someone ran you through a dungeon crawl.
Right. That's not what that game is for.
It's not the right tool for that job. If you want to run a dungeon crawl, then get out your dungeon crawl wrench. If you want to run this incredibly political, intricately plotted game, then get out your political, intricate plot wrench. Having a broad toolbox lets you play different games and systems designed to support that type of play.
Absolutely. And taking a look to see like if that's, and that might be the problem in your game. I think we've been in a lot of games where that is the issue, is that like what we're trying to do is just not what this game is meant to do, or the thing that we want isn't quite there. And like you said, if you played lots of systems, you can pull from other things. But I think like that goes back to sort of being solution oriented too, in that feedback, is saying like, okay, what is something else that maybe could do this better? Or maybe we're just trying to do something that we shouldn't be trying to do in this particular game. And that's okay too.
And what's really interesting is I remember, I believe it was Senda from She's a Super Geek talked about this a few times, where she was playing in I believe it was D&D 4E campaign. I could be wrong on the edition. Or it just wasn't feeling right. But then they moved to Fate. And then it worked out better. They were still playing the same characters, the same campaign, the same story, but they swapped systems. And they loved it so much better. So it's one of those things where you can keep the story going by hopping to a better system that will support your story better.
D&D 4E is the best tactical miniatures small unit war game on the market. Hands down, bar none, period. But if you're trying to tell the type of story that you would tell in Fate, which revolves a lot around, I would imagine, characters and their aspects and their stunts and these specific things, and being able to do all this stuff outside of combat, then
it's not the game for that.
It's not the game for that.
Yep.
And and that's not a measure of value of D&D or 4th edition or anything like that. It's just it's not what I wanted at that moment.
And you can't ask any game system to be all of those things. That's why there's so many game systems.
I think it took us a long time to finally learn that lesson, because we spent a lot of time in 4E trying to hammer and mold and shape and do crazy funny math and double hit points and half AC, for the longest time to get 4E to work for us. And then we finally were just like, well, let's try something different. And then all of a sudden, oh, hey, something different works for us.
Hey, someone else did all of that work for you. It's called a different game.
Yeah, exactly.
So to bring it back to the goal and the theory of constraints, one way that Eliyahu Goldratt talks about in the book, The Goal, which is a great book. It's a business novel. It's a novel, not a textbook. So it's really fun to read, and it communicates these business concepts. One way you identify as a constraint is you look for the machine in the factory, to use an analogy, that has the most inventory stacked up in front of it, waiting to be processed. I only almost burnt out as a GM once in years of playing, and that was in D&D 4E when I was having to do all of that work to make the system work. So I was such a constraint for even scheduling a game, because I needed 6 weeks between sessions to literally pull up a Visio template and redo all the math for the monsters to make combat work. And all of a sudden, I'm this incredible constraint, and we changed systems, and all that went away.
Wow. Are there things that you think every group then should discuss as part of a post-mortem or a wrap-up?
Mike and I talked about this before we recorded tonight, and at work, we see a lot of different models for feedback, right? There's start, stop, continue. There's SWOT analysis with your strengths, your weaknesses, your opportunities, your threats. There's looking at your towering strength. There's all these different ways to approach feedback. Those are ways to formalize it. And formalizing it can feel like this security blanket that you want to grab to make it easier to give feedback. But I really think it boils down to asking yourself a couple of questions, one of which I'll cover and one of which Michael covered because it was his idea. My question is the story that we just created together, because that's the goal of a session, is to create a story together. You can't lose sight of that. And it's so easy to lose sight of that. The story that we just created together, is it a movie I'd watch? Is it a book I'd read? Do I find it compelling? Do I find it interesting? Do I think this was something that was worthy of our time? Why or why not? And that's a question you can pose to the table that provokes some deep thoughts and kind of a whoa, wow, that is why we are all here at this table together playing. And it centralizes the discussion on that. So that's what I would focus, is bring up these philosophical questions. Even if it's a couple of sessions before people can wrap their mind around it enough to engage, start with philosophical and then do what Amelia suggested earlier and go after something more specific like the system. Use those things to get people into giving feedback, but don't let them lose sight of this story that you're creating together is the point of playing together.
And I think mine kind of brings it down a level, right? So if you do that kind of analysis and you can't get anywhere, and we kind of talked about this a little bit earlier, right? Bring it down to the basic question. Are we having fun? Why or why not? Was what we did, even if it was good, could it have been better? If it wasn't good, why wasn't it good? Why weren't we enjoying this? What's that roadblock? What's that constraint that's keeping us from having a good time? Cause with our group, we're friends. We were friends outside of D&D before we started playing, D&D RPGs. So, we could hang out and whatever and have a good time just enjoying each other's company. So I think for us, it was a little more challenging of saying, are we having fun doing this specific activity and then building on that specific activity?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I feel like those are the other thing that I would want to say about that too is that, you mentioned that it may take a couple times of going through that for people to really process that. And I think that's a thing that I want to encourage people to do too, is that even if your GM doesn't have feedback for you, or if as a GM your players don't have feedback, keep asking those questions, because now I'm at the point where we've done this so many times that I now go into a session and kind of watch for those things. Like, am I getting bored at certain points? And I will kind of mentally make note of that. And when we get done, I'll say, hey, this part kind of dragged for me. But even if people don't have a response right away, continue to ask those questions so that people kind of get in the habit of hearing them and can start keeping those in mind as they go through the session. It's like when you would have to do like a reading passage in school and you'd read the questions first so you knew what you were looking for. And so if you can kind of keep asking those questions, even if people don't have answers for you right away, it's still valuable because it puts people in the mindset of thinking those things through as they go.
Right, exactly. And one of the things I think of is you can preemptively gauge kind of what people's fun is by going through in your session 0, the types of fun that these people, that your players and as a GM enjoy. If you are playing a game that is all challenge based, all fights and dungeon traps and all that sort of stuff, and maybe a majority of your players enjoys that, maybe there's one person in your group that doesn't, and they're just going along because they just want to be with their friends. And maybe they're not having the greatest time. So it would be a good cue to be able to say, let's go ahead and add some story elements and see if we could make this all work together. It's a conversation that you can have both before and after a session, especially if you try to go at a certain angle after you have your initial session 0s and say, we tried to do this, we tried to interject this type of fun into the game, and maybe it worked in this way, maybe it didn't work in this other way. So there's a lot of different ways you can look at it once you know where everybody's baseline kind of sits.
Yeah, absolutely. I think having those conversations ahead of time can be helpful too, to say, these are things that like I know going into it that I want, and to be able to have those conversations and then afterwards have the time to analyze, did I get those things that I want? Did those things work for me? Are those things moving forward that I still want? Was that a thing that I was like, you know what, I definitely want to do this. And then I tried it and I was like, no, because my GM needs to know that too. Because if ahead of time I said, you know what, I really want to have like this romantic subplot for my character, and then we start doing it and it feels real icky, I need to let them know that it feels real icky so that we're not still doing that 10 sessions from now and I'm sitting here like, hiding in my sweatshirt, like, I don't like this. So like constantly reevaluating what those goals are too is really important. And I think that's a really valuable part of feedback, is revisiting those things that you said in session 0. Are those still true? They might not be, and that's okay.
Yeah, it's all about alignment. Communication's all about alignment. Starting out aligned, keeping aligned, and continuing that conversation. That conversation doesn't end.
Well, and that's a thing that I've been emphasizing from day one too, is that your RPG group is a relationship. Relationships thrive on communication. And sometimes that's really good, happy, positive communication. Sometimes that is critical or constructive feedback and saying, hey, these things are not working for me. But no matter what, you need to be having those kinds of discussions because a relationship does not work without communication. This has been a really, really great discussion. I feel like we've all learned some things here.
Agree.
Is there anything else that you guys want to cover that we didn't get to?
Actually, outside of the show notes, there is something that I want to say just off the cuff. I worry that anyone listening to this and who's gotten to this point in this episode is going to be like, my God, this is a lot to add to a game. Because we've just had this like 2-hour discussion on the importance of feedback and all the different ways you can do it. And I really want to emphasize, you can start small.
Yes.
And Mike, we do this. We have a whole show about it. We feedback our episodes to death.
Yep.
In any given play session, what percentage of the time is spent playing and what percent is spent giving feedback?
98 and 2%. We usually don't even give feedback during the game session. If anything, it comes after the fact when you send an email that we may or may not read, and then we reply to it at a later point. Or we have lunch and we talk about the game or at some other point, right? We rarely workshop our game during the game.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it feels like we've, my God, we've just belabored this for a super long time. It's going to be super hard to add to your game. Mm-hmm. No, it's really not.
No.
So you don't take all this advice at once. Mm-hmm. My goodness, don't take all this advice at once.
No.
No.
Choose one piece of it.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't have to be right away. That's a thing that we talked about too, is that like it can wait until tomorrow or like sometimes 2 days later. I have this thought of like, hey, I wanted to let you know that like the more I've thought about it, the more excited I am about this one particular plot thread that we started using or something like that. It doesn't have to be right after the session. It doesn't have to be a week later. It doesn't have to be in person. It can be whenever works for you too. The important part is that you're having that open communication.
So to belabor that point, everything we said earlier about the goal and theory of constraints and all of that, we discovered that 45 weeks ago. I'm looking at the timestamp on the episode. 45 weeks ago, we got that, and we're still working on that and implementing that feedback. It's a process. It takes time, baby steps.
Yeah, and the beautiful thing is that this is a collaborative, shared experience, and when you can take the game away from the table and talk about it with your friends and say, oh man, that was so cool. That plot thread that we went through was so cool. And, or it was great. And except for when this thing happened, then maybe, we could fix it by doing, something different. Or, oh, wouldn't it be cool if we did this instead next time? Having those out of game conversations is one of the really beautiful things about role playing in general, is because you're creating a shared memory experience with these people, and it's something that you own as a group. Nobody else, unless they're listening to your raw actual play footage, will have the same experience as you and have the same story in your head. So it's really cool that you can have this time aside from the game to just dive into that.
Yeah. And it takes time to build a culture around your table of these types of conversations. Start small. Don't get frustrated. It's taken Mike and I 8 years to get here. And that's not 8 years of like really dedicated 3 hours a week. No, it's 8 years of 5 minutes after every session. And play improves and the games improve and you have more fun. It's just a different way to think about how to spend the last 5 minutes of your session. It's about empowering yourself to grow, empowering those around you to grow by spending 5 minutes at the end of your game talking about your game. And start off in a really comfortable way with whatever topics you know are going to be non-confrontational, non-controversial, and then develop into those deeper topics if that's how you want to approach it.
Yeah, and I think that remembering that this doesn't have to be a formal, annual review with your boss. This doesn't have to be, a critical self-evaluation where if I don't grade myself high enough, then I won't get that raise or whatever. Like, this is supposed to be fun. And the whole point of this is to improve your experience. So if you sit down and have a feedback session and it doesn't feel good, it's okay to look at that too and offer feedback on that and say, like, this is, like the way that we structured this or the tone of it or something like that wasn't right. Because the entire goal is to make the experience of playing the game better. And everything that you do, all of the advice that we offer, everything that we go through on this show, the whole point is to make the experience better. Use what parts work for you. Don't use what parts don't work for you. Don't do things that don't make it better. Have fun. Don't do things you don't want to do. This is your fun time. RPGs are fun. Like, just do what works for you. And, it doesn't have to be serious. It can be as much as like, hey, that thing you did, it was pretty cool. Great. Awesome. There's some feedback. Just try it out. Hopefully it improves the experience overall. That's really the goal here.
I think you nailed it.
Yes. That was quality feedback. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much for sitting down with us. We really appreciate it.
It's our pleasure.
Yeah. Mike, could you go ahead and remind everyone where they can find you and your projects?
Mike G Plays Games on Twitch and at Mike G Plays Games on Twitter.
And Dusty, what about you?
Check us out on rpglessonslearned.com. or look for RPGLL, RPG Lessons Learned, on whatever your podcasting app of choice is. We are at RPGLL Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook.
Well, thank you guys both so much for joining us. Thank you to everyone for listening. Have a happy new year, and we will be back next week.
And next year.
And next year. Next week, next year. Character Evolution Cast, like Character Creation Cast, is a production of the One Shot Podcast Network and can be found online at www.charactercreationcast.com. Head to the website to get more information on our hosts and guests, or even find some of our character sheets. Character Creation Cast can be found on Twitter at CreationCast. I'm one of your hosts, Amelia Antrim, and I can be found on Twitter at Ginger Reckoning. Our other host, Ryan Bolter, can be found on Twitter at Lord Neptune. Music for this episode is used with a Creative Commons license, or with permission from the podcast it originated from. Further information can be found within the show notes. This episode was edited by Amelia Antrim. Further information for today's guest can also be found in the show notes. Thanks for joining us. And remember, we find that the best part of any role-playing game is character creation. So go out there and create some amazing people. We'll see you next time. Now we gotta read some show blurbs.
Show blurbs.
Show blurbs.
Show blurbs.
Show blurbs. Character Creation Cast is hosted by the One Shot Podcast Network. If you enjoyed our show, please visit oneshotpodcast.com, where you'll find other great shows like Modifier. Modifier is an interview show hosted by Megan Dornbrock, all about why and how people change games. From the hobbyist to the professional, from house rules to publication, we all have in mind a better way to play. What's yours?